The International Federation of Sports Physical Therapy is a worldwide federation representing 39 national sports physical therapy organisations. The intention of IFSPT is to be the international resource for sports physical therapists to promote the profession. The IFSPT works with member organisations and their individual members to promote sports physical therapy and safe participation in sport and physical activity through excellence in education, research, practice, and clinical specialisation. At the heart of the IFSPT are the sports physical therapy competencies and standards. These competencies provide a basis for policy development, enable quality assurance activities, and facilitate individual professional development. With this in mind, we open our IFSPT webinars with a look at the competencies and standards and welcome two of our past board members, Professor Nicola Phillips and Colin Paterson.
Hello everyone. Just to introduce ourselves, I'm Nicola Phillips and this is Colin Paterson. If you'd like to say hello, Colin.
Hi there. Thank you, Nikki.
We're going to talk to you in this session about developing an IFSPT approved specialist pathway in sports physiotherapy that we hope you'll find useful. So in this session, we're going to do a little bit about IFSPT, about expertise and specialism, to look at the IFSPT competencies, and then what you need to think about if you're developing a sports physiotherapy professional pathway in your country, because everywhere's going to be slightly different. So a little bit about the history of this first. IFSPT was established in December 2000. It's a recognised subgroup of the World Congress of Physical Therapy, and it aims to promote sports physiotherapy worldwide, improve the quality of our athlete support service, to communicate and exchange information, and to promote the standards of proficiency and really have benchmark statements to see what are minimum standards. So in 2004, we had a European Union grant-funded project called Sports Physiotherapy for All, and that allowed us to start creating a consensus idea of what would be the basic competencies needed to be called a sports physiotherapy specialist. Just to show that this is an ongoing process, things don't stop. The whole project is being revised again with an EU-funded project, and that project's going to last it started this year and it's going to go through to 2025. So again, it might change a little bit because our profession has evolved in that time, but essentially what you're looking at is going to be the same. So this session should still be relevant for you. I'm going to hand over to Colin now to talk about how it's important and how we develop expertise.
Thanks, Nikki. So yeah, as Nikki says, we're partly talking about devising a specialist pathway. So in terms of someone becoming a specialist and having in-depth knowledge of a particular area of practice. But also a key part to think about is, I suppose, not all specialists will become experts. There's something around the components of individuals' practice as someone develops their expertise, with experts typically having a wide range of knowledge, lots of contextual knowledge, having what might be called meta skills or Nikki, there we go. Kind of meta skills or metacognition. So whereby someone has developed their ability to reflect and learn from their practice, and they have kind of enhanced clinical reasoning skills, and kind of from the wider expertise literature that kind of Jensen et al. Have published quite a lot, have the characteristics of having a commitment to their patient and that caring approach. So kind of developing characteristics of expertise is also something that Nikki and I certainly encourage people to consider when developing a specialist pathway. And kind of the foundation, as per kind of the model or diagram that we created previously, highlights how someone might have technical knowledge, which is typically might be called propositional, but comes from science, literature, research. There's creative knowledge, where somebody starts to develop and use their technical knowledge in a more creative way, starting to problem solve actually within specific situations or a specific context, which very much again leads into this contextual kind of pillar to developing expertise, which is about making those decisions within a specific situation or context, and working with, in the sporting context, different practitioners of, again, from different professions. And it's kind of building on these three kind of foundations and pillars that allow someone to develop their expertise over this continuum. And it really is about the ability to flex and adapt that becomes really key, really, and especially with unfamiliar situations, which are very reflective of working in sport, where working in sport can vary so much. If we move on, Nikki. Thank you. So bearing in mind, in one side, we're talking about we need to think about how we can develop someone's expertise, help support, develop their knowledge and their practice and their reflection. And that's one thing when developing a pathway that we need to consider kind of from an educational perspective. And then the other part is the IFSPT competencies themselves. So there are the 11 competencies, as per the kind of the colourful diagram on the left, which are kind of designed around other master's level framework areas that really relate to about being an innovator, a professional leader, an advisor, and at the heart of it about, if you like, the more clinical aspects, I suppose you could describe, of managing the individual, which is where the injury prevention, rehab, performance enhancement characteristics are there. So there are these 11 competencies, and that is what the Sports Physiotherapy for All project developed. And hence, kind of 20 years ago, these competencies were developed. And it's just a reminder again, in terms of a competency is really about effective professional behaviors that integrate different knowledge types. Okay, and they're relevant in a specific context. So that's knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors that relate to a specific context, hence the sports physiotherapy context. So there are these competencies, and standards are how they're measured. They're really the minimum threshold for saying someone is demonstrating in their practice these competencies. So again, it's knowing what the competencies are in the document, and it's also knowing kind of the minimum benchmark level for that. Nikki, the next slide, please. So again, I think I've already said the difference there between a competency and measuring. Okay, so behaviors comprised of knowledge, skills, and attitudes, and that's related to those 11 areas. And then within the competency document, which there's an example of in a minute, is really the minimum threshold to know whether you're able to demonstrate the fact you achieve them or not, which I think the next slide gives an example. So this is competency 2. And this is how they're laid out. And obviously these competencies are available on the IFSPT website for you to download and to have an access to. And they just break them down into different areas. And they acknowledge, kind of when they were originally done, that different countries might have some specific national standards that need to be integrated. And again, I think, as Nikki will allude to shortly, that it's very much thinking about what's going on in your country, the needs of your country, and the fact that you can utilize these competencies and make them specific to make them work for you, which I think is what Nikki is now going to talk about.
Thanks, Colin. We're carrying on with our tag team. So some of the benefits of the IFSPT competencies. Having worked through the system and had our pathway approved by IFSPT, it means those that reach the highest standard in the UK can actually apply to become a registered international sports physical therapist. Now, that can be really quite useful if you are somebody that tends to travel with work quite a bit. It perhaps gives you a wider employment opportunities to demonstrate your standard of expertise. It's also really useful for the reverse of that, for teams that might be traveling overseas to another country. If we've harmonized those competencies, it means if somebody is a registered international physical therapist, sports physical therapist, you know that they will have a certain set of skills and a certain standard of clinical reasoning and expertise that you could then perhaps recruit their help in another country. So lots of other things that you can do, as well as obviously giving the benchmarks for educators and so on. But it does make it much more transparent if we can share those standards. So how do you start to go about developing a new IFSPT approved pathway? And this is where you need to start thinking about, well, we have our competencies. We know what you need to be a specialist sports physiotherapist. And Colin has also talked through the model that we've used about the general steps that you take and the skills and the knowledge that you acquire as you develop from a novice to an expert. So if you think that's where you need to put those two things together, and we're aiming at that expert level in all those competencies, and you have to think about how you start to do that, whether it's through technical, creative, or contextual methods. So if you are going to do that in your country, and you think, where do you need to start? Well, a good place to look at is what already exists. What can you use that already map to the competencies that have been set internationally? Do you have M-level post-registration courses? Again, if you have plenty of those, or even just one or two of them, you can then allow yourself to be able to say, well, we have provision for our members to follow an M-level education that is the foundation that you then add some of the other experiential knowledge and expertise to that. Then you need to start thinking about that. The other side of it is, how do you demonstrate those other skills, the clinical skills, the contextual knowledge? How can that be shown in your country? And every country will be slightly different. And if you look at the pathways of the countries that have been approved, we all have slightly different ways of going about that. But one of the things to ask yourself is, do you have practical courses as well as M-level courses? And if so, does your sports physiotherapy organisation approve any of those, or are they ad hoc? So then you can start to say, right, well, how do we fill the gaps? What have we got? What do we need to have for the competencies? What bits do we need to start developing to get a whole pathway approved? And so that might be setting up a master's level course in partnership with the university, or it might be that you have those and you need to look at more approved clinical related courses that, again, your organisation approves in your country. How can you facilitate shadowing experience, or to have enough mentors to help people through that sort of developmental stages? And how will you map the structure of the IFSPT competencies with what you have in your country, bearing in mind that these are going to be reviewed over the next few years as well? And so then you need to think about, how will you assess? And I think I pass on to you here, Colin, to look about how you would assess some of these things.
So absolutely. So part of creating a pathway for people to use as a framework to support their learning in order to generate the knowledge, skills, attitudes that are required as part of the competencies is then thinking about how you're going to assess these. And it might be a combination of ways. And that could be partly through an approved, accredited master's level course, because fundamentally the pathway is at that level 7 or master's level, and that might form part of your assessment. But there might be other parts of your pathway that you need to consider how you're going to assess learning from practice, which is so key for developing the contextual, situated kind of learning that's required to develop expertise. It's not all about formal learning. How are you going to assess that in a way that's going to work for you? And also thinking about, once people have achieved the award, are there any regulatory requirements in your country that you need to integrate about how often people demonstrate ongoing continuing professional development or learning? And is that going to be integrated into a reassessment process for your organisation, or is there another organisation that will naturally allow that to happen? So again, it's thinking about the application form. What is it you're actually assessing that you want on that application form, in conjunction with how they're going to demonstrate the formal learning requirements, the reflective practice requirements, and then thinking about that once someone's achieved an award, are you going to have a mechanism for ensuring ongoing professional development? And that will differ depending on your current requirements in your country and current practice. So in a sense, that overview of designing a process, I think key things to consider is to be aware of the minimum standards and benchmarks, which is what the competency document sets out. Again, there might be requirements in your own country that require you to have additional requirements, because again, the generic competency document will have some specific adaptations that might be needed in your own country. So it's a case of working that out in terms of what is it that you need in your country. Once you've got that awareness, it's looking for the gaps that you need to fill when you're designing a program, and what those gaps, whether that's more formal learning or filling in the gaps with how to evidence that more informal learning. But fundamentally, it needs to work within the culture of your organization and any regulatory requirements in your country. And certainly thinking about the future proofing of it as time goes on, and once it's developed, to ensure people maintain standard is also key. So it's that combination of thinking about how you as an organization are going to support the learner to develop these things, and also you have a responsibility for kind of the assessment and almost quality assurance of your pathway. And it's how you put those two things together that are going to be key, ensuring that it's kind of fit for purpose for your country. And I think Nikki can come in there if she wants to add anything in our summary.
No, I think you summarised it perfectly. We hope you found this useful. And hopefully there'll be more of a library of these things to be able to use as resources, and perhaps different countries will talk about how they develop their pathways to perhaps give you more insight as well. So for that, thanks for that, and we'll say goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.